librarians. Welcome to another episode of Echoes in the Atrium, podcast to Library of the Unknown, a companion channel to Library of the Untold. This conversation was hosted by my illustrious library cohort, Nico, and myself, Lippin. And we were happy to be joined by fellow YouTuber and podcaster Keelan of Formscapes and the Aeon Institute at Discord. In a response echoing forward from a prior discussion held by Keelan and his own guests, the aim was to segment out parts of that dialogue, reacting to key themes we found significant, to then further contextualize meaning. And as happens with any great content, we found ourselves running down a few interesting side quests. Nevertheless, the fact that so much remains to be responded to perhaps points to a return to this conversation in future podcasts. That said, to anyone new listening, thank you for joining us. We're happy to be back from a brief pause to feature a highly anticipated guest. This is Echoes in the Atrium for Library of the Unknown, and we proudly welcome Keelan of Formscapes.
All right, yeah, so my name is Keelan Morgan. I am a philosopher, for lack of a better term, and I mostly create very long-form video essays about various topics within philosophy and science and metaphysics and esotericism and lots of things like that on my YouTube channel, which is called Formscapes. And yeah, that's basically what I do. Now, the clip that we are about to watch is from a discussion I had with the guys over at Demystify Sci podcast, Michael and Anna, who are great friends of mine. And yeah, I guess we can just go ahead and play a bit of that and we can start to unpack things.
Here, here. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for being on with Lippin and I. We are super honored and proud to have you even join us for a podcast. But then the content that we have to discuss is so breathtakingly mind-boggling that I'm super excited to get into it. For the Library of the Unknown podcast, sister channel to the Library of the Untold, where we discuss such things with such brilliant minds as yourself.
Alrighty, great. Glad to be here. Of course, love the Library of the Untold and have for a very long time. So it's good to be here. And yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so where we're starting in the video is sort of toward the beginning where Keelan is being interviewed by Demystify Sci, another YouTube channel with brilliant minds as well. And they are discussing the origins of Christianity and how it is affecting our current ecosystem culturally. So you want to go ahead and start it, and then we'll have like a little backstory.
Might be a slightly hyperbolic way of putting it, but generally I think I would agree. Insofar as I think I would put it this way. There was a kind of compromise that had to happen during this very pivotal period of history because, you know, the people getting fed to lions were lunatics, man. Like, these people really believed it. And the problem is, if you have a whole bunch of people, particularly, I don't know, like slaves in your giant evil empire, believing something like that, that's very dangerous. And so when I look to kind of the Romanized forms of Christianity, and of course, eventually we would have that split between East and West, but that to me looks like a kind of compromise that had to be made in order for really the social order of that civilization to preserve itself. Because again, like, if you follow Christianity to the letter, I mean, it's the most like bomb throwing anarchist shit you can imagine, right? Like, give away all your possessions, and I know there's a lot of Christians who would disagree with me. They really like to, you know, look at the text and the things Jesus said and kind of like, you know, well, oh, he didn't really mean give away all your possessions, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, I think it's quite clear that the Paleo Christians didn't see it that way. They took it very literally. And so, yeah, and this is kind of where the story launches off, I think, because there's this pivotal transformative period here where Christianity becomes institutionalized, not as this scattering of weird, disjointed cults, but as like a thing, like the thing that we know of as Christianity today, with the Roman Church and Constantinople and all that stuff. And there's compromises that also happen at the level of theology and metaphysics, and this is where things get really interesting, I believe. So probably the most significant philosopher for medieval Christianity was Aristotle, right? And the way that, let's say, Roman Christianity came to navigate this, they came to interpret Christianity through this lens of Aristotelian metaphysics, and it allowed for this kind of harmony, as it were, between like the traditional Neoplatonic Aristotelian tradition of Western philosophy and this new outrageous thing that seemed to be poised to tear the world asunder. But it was an uneasy compromise in a lot of ways. And in particular here, one of the main differences we could look to between Christianity and these other forms of like Neoplatonic mysticism is that the fundamental conviction of Christianity is not about some kind of abstract philosophical concept. Like if you're a Neoplatonist and you want to believe in like the monad of Plotinus or the Platonic form of the good, you can convince yourself of that literally just sitting with your eyes closed in your basement. Like you don't have to witness anything for that to be true. But in order to really believe in Christianity, that demands something far, far more radical. The death and resurrection of Christ is evidence of something that could never be an abstract concept, because what it's supposed to evidence really is that the will that underlies reality itself cares not just about love in this abstract sense or some kind of, cosmic harmony or whatever, but it actually cares about you personally. If you allow for this letting go, this radical vulnerability that Christianity demands of us, then you're not going to be allowed to just drown.
This is incredibly important. It means a lot to me.
Right?
I want to rewind and listen to the previous maybe 1.5 minutes over again of what you just said, so I could digest it. Because it's what so much of us intellectually try to parse out in our heads. The difference between like logically arriving at a philosophy when you're just cognizing, to yourself, and like you just said just there, anyone can do that in the privacy and the dark of their own space, and many have, and they've written this down. But what is this greater thing? You put it way better than I do, but like an experiential sense of the reality of the thing. It's not just an abstract concept anymore. It's a living process that you are in relationship with. And the way you put it was just perfect. So, can we get you to sort of echo yourself here again, maybe for a quick moment? Or Nico, do you have anything to say?
Absolutely. So, what we need to understand here is that this promise of salvation then sets up a kind of dialectical tension within the Western soul, one which really would be like a powder keg. It would be the thing that blew the whole damn thing apart and gave us the Renaissance, and then eventually the birth of modernity, the scientific revolution, capitalism. Everything that we take for granted in the modern world came from this breakdown of this compromise between Christianity and Aristotelianism. And there are various different aspects of this. But the primary thing here is belief, really, that the events described in the Gospels actually occurred. Because if they didn't, then so what? Right? You know, who cares? I mean, like, yeah, sure, great. Okay, there's a God and there's this cosmic harmony and blah, 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 whatever. But, you know, if I'm being asked to put everything on the line, I need to be able to really feel this conviction that will, that cosmic telos cares about me personally enough that it's the right thing for me to do, to align myself with that, as opposed to doing the things that we typically do in order to preserve ourselves in the world. You know, we do step on other people's toes. We do, you know, kick other people down as we're trying to climb ladders. We do build up these walls to defend ourselves. And Christianity is this very radical claim to just let it all go. To let it all go, and it'll all sort itself out, because love matters. And in particular, we as individual persons have a place within that narrative, where we're not just going to be eaten by the damn wolves when we let our guard down. That's difficult. That's very difficult. And what ends up happening here is that the need for certainty in that will eventually become this really Cartesian revolution, right? This is the primary concern of Descartes, is doubt. He doubts everything he can possibly doubt, and he backs himself into a corner trying to find something that he can feel absolutely certain about. And what he finds is the cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. The one thing that he cannot doubt is his self, his ego, but also what he finds is the source of all doubt, all fear, all anxiety, all paranoia, is that core of subjectivity. And there's some really spooky things going on here. I think, therefore I am. There's a lot more going on in that sentence than most people realize, I think. A lot of people will look at that and be like, well, that's just kind of a, you know, flippant tautological statement. No, it isn't. No, it is not at all. And especially if we start digging into what's going on in between the lines of the Hebrew Bible, we start to see some really weird things, right? So I mentioned this in the podcast, but the one true God that comes to the rescue of the Hebrews within the story of Moses says that his name is Aya, I am, right? And there's all kinds of different interpretations of this, but it's very interesting that in that dialogue, Moses doesn't feel like his question has been answered. The burning bush says, I am Aya, I am. And he's like, well, which Elohim am I talking to? Like, which Elohim should I tell the Hebrews sent me? And the bush says, tell them I am sent you. Tell them Aya sent you. There's something very, very deep and profound going on here in terms of the cosmological significance of subjectivity itself. Right? And now when we fast forward then to the Renaissance, this period with Descartes, this period in which we're seeing perspectivity in art really coming about in a very pronounced way for the first time. And eventually that's going to become this inward turn that is going to really just take over the entire Western world. We will see this deepening over time as we move through these different major thinkers of the modern era, moving from Descartes to Hume to Kant to Fichte to Hegel and so forth. There's this plunging inward that humanity begins to go through, and it's triggered by something in Christianity. And there's a very, very profound mystery here, I believe.
Okay, that's yeah.
I would 100% agree, and I feel as though your Alfred North Whitehead mind trying to find the coherence in all of this is very apparent, and I love it, and I'm following the whole thing. And my thing is that the big compromise that you were talking about, when I first was listening to it, I was thinking, oh yeah, that like the Pax Romana, right? No, we're not even talking about like social systems yet. You're talking about the internal compromise that the individual believer has to make in order to follow this system, right? In order to accept Jesus or whatnot, right? There's a compromise.
Well, let's talk more about that compromise then, because there's a number of things going on here. Really the whole narrative of Christianity is a paradox, like the God man. I mean, that's just a contradiction, straight up, right? Gods are supposed to be universals, right? And what's more particular than the life experience of an individual human being? How could it be that a man, just some dirty vagabond, could be God? And throughout the history of Christian theology, you find all kinds of different ways of making sense of that. But within the Aristotelian compromise I was talking about, this is done in a very interesting way. Because within that Aristotelian compromise, you have the incorporation of this Neoplatonic and Aristotelian division between form and formlessness. Okay, and this is something that really comes about from the axial age. We see this happening in the East and the West, but in mirrored ways, right? So formlessness is undifferentiated oneness. It's what the Greeks would have called chaos. It is the void, the abyss, right? It is darkness. And form is form. It is the monad of Plotinus. It is the idea of unity. It's the Platonic forms, right? And within the East and the West, you're going to have two different ways of demarcating the appearance-reality distinction. Within the East, ultimate reality is going to be attributed to formlessness, to that underlying oceanic oneness that gets called Brahman, Sunyata, Anatta, that kind of thing. And it's form, which will be seen as mere appearance, right? And so all of the differences and delineations and things in the world, that's all considered to be somewhat illusory within the Eastern traditions, whereas in the West, you have the exact mirror image of that. You have formlessness being associated with non-being, with unreality, while form is considered to be true reality itself. And you see these Greek philosophers like Plato and Plotinus really struggling with this, about what is the role of this divine darkness, this receptacle or great mother, that's what Plato calls it, that seems to be necessary in order for there to be a world at all, even if we're presuming a kind of eternal transcendental realm of perfect forms, then why not just that? Why should there be mere appearance at all? Well, if your cosmology is one that divides between reality as form and unreality as formlessness, then the mere apparentness of that which we encounter immanently in the natural world is the participation of form in non-being, in the nothing, right? This receptacle, this formlessness. And so you have a kind of moralistic distinction here as well. The world of the forms is the world of perfection. It is the world of timelessness. It is the world of pure unity and perfection, whereas then the Cora, what Plato calls it, the great mother, the formlessness, the darkness, this is considered to be the source of all the imperfection, all of the indeterminacy, all of the strife, all of the mere apparentness that we encounter in nature. And so, in other words, form good, formlessness bad. This creates a big problem once Christianity comes into the picture, because how can it be that God is fully perfect and fully man at the same time if being an embodied corporeal human being necessarily means being contaminated by this formless darkness? This was a problem. And you see some pretty serious struggles with this in the history of medieval Christian theology. Now, let me get to the point real quick. So you guys are probably familiar with these Renaissance paintings, or medieval paintings. It actually kind of stops being as much a thing during the Renaissance, but these paintings where you'll have the baby Jesus and he looks like really hideous for some reason. And it's so funny because I've seen so many commentaries on this, like, why did they make baby Jesus look so ugly? And the reason for this is hilarious, but also points us towards the problem that was there within that medieval Aristotelian compromise. Basically, the idea here within this Aristotelian cosmology is that you had this distinction between forms, so you had the psychical substance, or you could say the spirit of a thing, consists of these perfect unchanging forms, right? And then you have the materiality, and you can think of it like that perfect unchanging eternal complex of forms that is like the ideal you, right? The glorified body is trying to take your corporeal form and purify it, right? By bringing it into accordance with that perfection. So in other words, your body is kind of like an imperfect shadow of this Platonic ideal that is essentially your soul within this way of thinking. Well, with Jesus, that becomes a bit of a problem, right? Because what's implied here is that a child is more formless than the adult. That as we age, we more closely approximate this perfect form that is dictating our like physiological and psychological development, right? So this implies that children, infants, saplings, whatever the case may be, seeds, are more imperfect than the adult completed version of the organism, right? And so with baby Jesus, this becomes a problem, because if you depict baby Jesus as being a baby, then you're implying that he is less perfect than his, completed man self, right? And so what they tried to do is quite literally make it so that the baby Jesus looked like a shrunken down version of the adult Jesus, so that they could kind of sidestep this in a weird way. It's hilarious, but it points to what's going on here, that you've got this struggle within the very notion of good and evil, and how that was conceptualized within the Western world, and how the whole story of Christianity poses this insurmountable challenge to that. And there are other things that we could get into here as well. I won't go off on a huge tangent about it, but for example, some medieval theologians tried to say that Jesus never had a truly material body, right? Because material means corporeal, it means imperfect, right? So they were basically trying to argue that he was this like purely spiritual apparition from birth to death. And there were different things like that. Even if you're conceding that prior to his resurrection, Jesus did have this kind of imperfection he was carrying within him, then the Aristotelian way of looking at this would still be to say that after the resurrection, he was perfected. He was the glorified body, right? Which consisted of nothing but pure spirit, pure forms, pure eternal perfection, right? But then you've got a huge problem with that too, which is that after Jesus comes back, one of the first things he does is that he shows his wounds in his hands and his side to his disciples to show that he is in fact the same person who was crucified. How can it be that a perfect Platonic ideal has puncture wounds that came from like physical spears, right? So there's all these struggles with trying to reconcile Christianity with really just the whole Western tradition itself. And it was very complicated and very messy, and it was a tension that would eventually be released by the complete breakdown of the medieval Christian world during the Renaissance.
Agreed, 100%. But then too, it would only be the Western mind that would be able to be vulnerable enough to fall into that belief system, because they didn't have backstory from Egypt or the Orient or India, taught in schools or regularly available to them. Unless they went off to like a very fancy college, they wouldn't have access to the backstories of these other cultures where the death and resurrection and transmigration of Christ is just a retelling of the Osiris story and previous cultural stories in the same manner, right? So because they could almost impress it upon fresh minds, they could retell it however they wanted, or they could fill in the gaps with this magic here, a splash of prayer there, a little bit of angel over here, and it all makes sense, right? Because Jesus is magic. But if you had taken,
you do see these precursors of the story of Christianity and the story of Osiris, or even the story of Dionysus, for that matter. You have these intimations of this narrative, and in fact, you can really see the life of Christ, that story, as kind of like all of these myths kind of coming together into one giant climax in a way. In fact, I think that's the best way of looking at it here. But there's some major differences. There are things that are there in the Christian story that you're not going to get out of Osiris or Dionysus or Vishnu or anyone else like that, or Quetzalcoatlus for that matter. And it's simply that Jesus was supposed to be just some dude. He was just a guy. He wasn't a god. Like Osiris being dismembered and resurrected is one thing, and it certainly has a lot of profound meaning, metaphysically speaking. But nonetheless, you can fit that into that Western way of thinking about things, where you have this good and evil distinction between light and darkness, form and formlessness. That was there in Egypt too. It was there in the Greeks. It was there in the Mesopotamians. It goes all the way back to the beginnings of the Neolithic era. There's a threshold that is being crossed in the story of Christianity. And it's true that in the Western world, in the medieval Europe, they barely had access to the Greeks, let alone the ancient Egyptians. But that would start to change during the Renaissance with these figures like Giordano Bruno and these other mystics who would start trying to connect the dots between Christianity and these more ancient mystic traditions. But in any case, what's really significant here is this. The way that Christianity forces this really unavoidable confrontation with the way that humanity, Western humanity in particular, tended to conceptualize the natural world, the embodied corporeal world, as fallen. That is shattered by Christianity, and you can see really the entire medieval period as the Western world trying to hold on to that way of conceptualizing reality and reconciling it with Christianity, and it just couldn't be done ultimately.
No, I agree 100%. And even with the Christian like lore, and you can't even say ancient Christian because there's nothing about Christianity that's ancient, right? So you would have to say ancient Hebrew lore. With Enoch and all of that, even the fallen angels, Anunnaki, whatever you want to call them, even that retelling in the new Christian age is twisted and warped and adapted to a more political agenda. Yes. No. You guys follow me?
Well, the politics is definitely important here, because what the Romans, and by the Romans, I want to broaden that. I'm not just talking about the Roman Empire prior to what's typically considered its fall. If we look at Romanism, let's say, as a kind of social organization, then that never dies. It continues with the Byzantine Empire. It continues with the Holy Roman Empire, Charlemagne. that whole thing. And you see it recurring repeatedly throughout Western history, and quite explicitly as well. You see this in the Napoleonic Empire, and the British Empire, and the American Empire, in the Russian czars. I mean, there's this Roman spirit that is continually trying to reassert itself, and it's never quite able to do so. And again, we should look to the Gospels here, the way that Jesus is really defining his mission in contrast to Rome, right? So he performs his exorcism on the man, casts the demons into the swine. That demon says that its name is Legion, right? So this isn't just saying that the demon is some kind of like hive mind, like the Borg or whatever. It's saying that that demon that is in that man is the same spirit that is marching the Roman legions, right? And there are numerous things, render unto Caesar, blah blah blah. We know the quotes, but what is being pointed towards here is a radically different form of social organization, a radically different form of human community that is diametrically opposed to the Roman way of organizing society. And here again, we can understand this best, I think, by contrasting East and West. Within the East, with China, Japan, China is probably the best example of this. Social cohesion was achieved primarily through cultural and social homogeneity, right? So as the Chinese Empire expanded into Mongolia, Manchuria, Tibet, Central Asia, their expansionistic efforts were always efforts of basically converting the conquered peoples to becoming Han Chinese. They wanted everyone within the empire to worship the way the Han Chinese did, speak the same language, to have the same social customs, et cetera, et cetera. There was this indoctrination, as it were, of trying to create more Han Chineseness, because that uniformity was seen as the basis for social solidarity. Within the West, and this goes all the way back to the Achaemenid Empire or even further, you have a very different strategy. And largely this has to do with geography, simply. I mean, the Near East and the Mediterranean world are far more fragmented than China, right? Or India, for that matter. So there was this barrier where that kind of homogeneity simply wasn't an option. You couldn't just make everyone into Romans. You could not just make everyone into Persians or Babylonians or whatever the case. There was this need to accommodate cultural and social differences. And so instead of that being the basis for social cohesion, the basis for social cohesion was instead militaristic and financial exploitation. The Romans didn't need everybody to be Romans. They just needed people to pay their damn taxes, and basically the modus operandi was that. It was pay your dues, abide by our laws, and we won't fucking kill you. Easy peasy, right? And that is exactly what Christianity is defining itself in contrast to. But again, that doesn't end. Once Christianity comes about, there's this kind of mutant hybrid synthesis of the Roman and the Christian that occurs, and this is brought about, of course, by Constantine and then Charlemagne and so on and so forth. I mean, the whole history is that of this uneasy attempt to reconcile those two spiritual forces, as it were, at work in shaping human society.
And then there we have another compromise within Christianity at that point in its new, post supposed Jesus lifetime era. The first century Christians, the Valentinian schools of thought, were all very hippie in nature comparatively to the traditional schools of thought. And then when you do the compromise that Constantine did, what you have to do is give a little to get a little, right? So a lot of the truth of the underlying origin belief system of Christianity is gone at this point. What we have left is the simulacra of a belief system that nobody can even validate anymore, right? So at this point, it's just free game for politics to come in and make it whatever they want, which is how the Romans did anyway. Not so much as a blending of cultures like you say China did, but more like a taking over of cultures. But then always in the West, there is this caste system situation where you're not really a Roman. So I won't, consider you a Roman. You're a foreigner in the country that Rome now occupies, right? So they were never considered equal. Whereas if you were taken into the Chinese empire or whatever, you were now Chinese. Here and forevermore.
Right. And so the Roman Empire is an empire of slaves. And in fact, the social disparity of the Roman Empire had the gap between the haves and the have-nots, let's say, had widened tremendously over the lifetime of the empire, and really it began during the Republic period, because the wars that the Romans engaged in, the wealthy elites would use those essentially just to keep the soldiers out on the field for as long as possible. Not for the sake of conquering new territory, that was just a bonus. The real motivation there was actually taking this kind of landed middle class, right? Because that's what soldiers were initially within the Roman Republic. They were landowning, kind of like minor nobility, you could say, middle class, for lack of a better term. But the elites wanted to expand their power. And so what they would do is they would, start a war, send all the Roman soldiers off to die in battle. And if they died, great, because then their land gets up for sale and it can be bought on the cheap by the elites. Or they don't die, and it doesn't matter anyway, because they've been gone for years. Their farmstead is in total disrepair. They get back. What are they going to do? Well, you could sell it, right? And so what ends up happening here is the elites end up gobbling up all the land, and the Roman middle class ends up being replaced with this landless kind of urban proletariat, as it were, and slaves. And that was basically, you had the bottom rung, and then you had this extremely hedonistic, extremely exorbitantly wealthy elite, which wielded unimaginable power. And that's the stage. That's the stage that Christianity is going to step onto. And so it's not hard to see that a religion which is saying everyone, including the slaves, including the have-nots, in fact, the destitute in particular, are the children of God. That had obvious appeal within the late Roman Empire.
I would agree. And I don't know how many veterans you know, but I know quite a few veterans. And everything that you just described about the Roman elite and their plan to keep their soldiers and their competition and their landowners away is still happening currently in America as we speak, because veterans go off and they give their lives and they give their loyalty and they give their honor to the country that they represent, and then they come back and they're just tossed aside and forgotten and given a bunch of psychotherapy drugs, and they're either contractors or they're broken, and they're definitely not competition for the elite. The strongest men are rendered no longer even noteworthy when they come back. You know what I mean? Like it's just, as you were explaining it, it really reminded me of like a current veteran situation, which makes me really sad, but also kind of like, we got it honest, right? Rome is our parent country.
Indeed, the Roman Empire never died. It's still here with us to this very day. It's in all of our institutions, in the banks, in the European Union, in the United States federal government. It's a archetype. It's an archetype of consolidating power, and it's one which is at this stage probably at the greatest height that its power has ever been at. I mean, can the Roman emperors would have drooled over the power that is now wielded by Vanguard and City Street and BlackRock. You know, that's the Roman Empire of the modern world.
100%. And I would also go as far as to say that without all of that happening, we would not even be in the age of intelligence, the age of Aquarius. Like the age of enlightenment was brought on because all of these events happened, right?
Yeah, and I would say that at this particular moment in history, right now, we're at a particularly pivotal moment because we went through this period of cultural decay, really. I mean, that you had this complete breakdown of community, complete breakdown of religiosity, spirituality. You had the advent of this very atheistic physicalism, scientism, all of that kind of came to a peak during the 20th century. It really began, I mean, you can trace it all the way back to the Renaissance, really, but it certainly peaked, I would say, in the late 20th century or early 21st century. And now it's crumbling because people are starting to wake up a bit and starting to say, actually, you know what? This is not working. I am miserable. And I feel like there's just more of the world than is being spoon-fed to me by my textbooks and you know, the PhDs behind their pulpits preaching about the Big Bang or what have you. There's a greater mystery here, and there is this feeling, this conviction that I see is arising within human beings that we do actually have a very central place here in this cosmic narrative. And so what we're going through right now, I believe it's actually a kind of counteraction to the Copernican revolution, right? So Copernicus says, okay, the Earth's not the center of the universe anymore. Kant has his own little version of the Copernican revolution where he basically renders all truth as this kind of perspectival hallucination created by the brain. And so we've gradually become more and more decentered. We've been told over and over again that it's mature and wise to understand that we're just, you know, dirt molded into biological vehicles and that there's no real meaning or purpose to it, and we're really just on the same level as all the other plants and animals. And you know, some people who are indoctrinated into that, you know, tend to buy it whole cloth and try to live with it. Very often they find that they can't. But I'm seeing more and more today, especially in the wake of the internet, the wake of this completely new way that people have begun to educate themselves, that a lot of people are looking at that and they're just saying, you know what, that just doesn't even pass the smell test. It just doesn't work for me. That's like obviously false. So what is the truth then? And now you've got traditional religion trying to kind of swoop in and scoop people up who are fleeing from that scientific atheist physicalism. And they're having some success, frankly. I've noticed a lot of people, a lot of Zoomers in particular, are very attracted to Eastern Orthodox Christianity. I've seen a lot of converts to Catholicism. I've seen a lot of people drifting towards things like Buddhism and whatnot, but I personally don't believe that any of that is going to be sustainable. I think that traditional forms of religion broke down for a reason, and they're only going to continue breaking down because the people who are looking to that to save them from their nihilism are going to find just a different flavor of nihilism in the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. And they're going to have to find themselves ultimately in the no man's land where it's like, well, you know what? Fuck it. I guess I'm just going to have to figure this out on my own. And that's exactly where we're at right now.
Good, because that's exactly what the whole fucking Jesus message was about. Fucking think for yourselves and quit doing what everybody tells you to do. You are bigger than your job. You are bigger than your church. You're bigger than your family. You are bigger than this existence. There's more beyond death, and there's more beyond life. And people are having access now to the capacity to have questions answered instantly and not have to trust their preacher, right? You know, like the Bible was great for illiterate people, right? But once you have literate people with AI, you know, giving them access to every book recorded in human history, there's going to be questions that come up that the Bible can't answer. And since the people that wrote the Bible are no longer around to answer those questions, they just lead to more questions. And filling those gaps is kind of a journey, right? Answering those questions is kind of the whole experience. And without all of this happening beforehand, the question wouldn't even be a thing. So the question is important. And the way that you get there is either fun or dangerous.
Right. And so one thing we should keep in mind, you know, the big picture here is that every bit of this, modernity, the Renaissance, the birth of capitalism, everything all the way to the present day, every bit of this has been driven by Christianity. Even atheism, you know, and secular materialism, you can see those as outgrowths of Christianity. This whole process of breakdown, it has been facilitated by that. And I think probably the best way of looking at it is something like this. When a caterpillar needs to go through metamorphosis to become a butterfly, it creates a chrysalis around itself because it has to liquefy its body. It has to completely break itself down in order to reconstitute itself as the butterfly. The chrysalis serves a very important purpose. It allows the caterpillar to break down without dying. Modernity is doing that. Techno-industrial capitalism, whatever you want to call it, this whole modernist machine we've erected around ourselves is allowing our psyches and our collective psyche, our cultures, our religious beliefs, our forms of spirituality, all of these things are disintegrating right now. They've been disintegrating for quite a while. And we've created a chrysalis to allow us to do that without dying. Because if we had attempted to do so, you know, in the Middle Ages or the ancient world or whatever the case, we'd all be dead. You know, a people within the pre-modern world, you know, their belief systems, their culture, these things had to be accurate enough to reality, in alignment enough with the reality of human life that human beings could actually survive and form communities and families and reproduce and perpetuate themselves. Because if that stopped working, then guess what? You just die. You get eaten by the wolves. You get conquered by your neighbors. Everyone starves to death, whatever the case may be. There was very little wiggle room. There was very little room for mistake, and that's why we should take ancient philosophies very seriously, because that was the gauntlet that all of those belief systems were put through. So there's very profound truths to be found there, but nonetheless, what we're going through right now is a kind of metamorphosis. There's a breakdown that's happening, and there's a reconstitution that breakdown points towards. And whatever that reconstitution is what's hidden in Christianity. And it's the thing that we haven't really been able to see until now, I believe.
Do you mean
that there's an
that which Christianity hides?
And subjectivity, and in that we matter. No matter what kind of struggle we have to go through, we're gonna create the necessary sandbox for exploring what we have to explore, go through what we have to go through in order for this, to allow this chrysalis, right?
Indeed, yes, and well, what I mean by reconstitution, though, to be a little bit more explicit, I believe that the human ego is about to enter into a new phase. And, you know, a lot of my work on Formscapes has been about tracing out this history of human ego evolution, the way that our sense of selfhood has changed over time, really since the end of the Paleolithic, and we could probably trace it back even further than that, but we have very little historical records of anything prior to that. There are these transformative processes through which the human self has changed, the way that we conceptualize ourselves and the way that we experience ourselves in the world, the way that we conceptualize the world and our relationship to it. These things have evolved over time. And right now, I think we're going through a bottleneck. And what's on the other side of that is a very different kind of human ego. And I think we can see a number of things that are going to be very central to that new kind of human selfhood. And those things, I believe, are freedom, creative freedom, individual moral agency, individuality. It's the individual human subjectivity, which is really in the crosshairs right now. And again, we can see that intimated within the story of Christ, that there is a God within the individual human being, even if that individual human being is not a demigod or a saint or anything, but literally just some guy.
What I'm hearing, you're saying,
So you're thinking that in
principle is subjectivity, and in that we matter.
or that we
Yeah,
need
I would say
believe
that
so.
I would say that subjectivity is the first moment of becoming. It's there's something a little bit more fundamental underneath that, in the sense that you could point towards this completely homogeneous state of just pure being / non-being, this kind of Brahman type of thing. But in order for that to become a reality, there has to be the self-reflectivity of that pure, undifferentiated consciousness. And that loop, that self-reflection,
Sorry, I didn't mean it.
yeah, that is subjectivity then.
Process between subjectivity and objectivity here, which kind of, if that makes things matter, I love how what you're doing here is it just nonchalantly kind of throws Pascal's wager completely out the window, and it's essentially, it's just a cop-out, Pascal's wager to sort of just who cares about knowing for sure, just act like it because you can't, and why would you do that, right? If there is indeed an inherent relationship, and you're just, that you would simply be ignoring it and doing that. So
And that
Yeah,
might be that
Go ahead.
dialectic tension he was talking about when we were talking about the Aristotle, Christianity compromise, when he was talking about within the believer, I guess, within the believer themselves, they have that tension of, do I submit to the authority, or do I explore my own, like you said, creative subjectivity? Or how do I combine the two, right? That was the compromise, to combine them in such a way as to promote growth for both.
Well, if we're looking at subjectivity as absolutely fundamental to reality itself, then the duality of subjectivity and objectivity itself starts to break down, because then all you have is intersubjectivity. You have subjectivities within subjectivities. You have this ocean of feeling, effectively. And this is really important because this points us towards a very different way of conceptualizing nature, right? If we look to the history of modern science, what we're told is that, there's no colors in the world. Those are all just in your head. There are no feelings outside of you. That's all just something that your brain does. There's no musicality in the world. That's all just because of our weird neurophysiological predispositions towards certain kinds of patterns and blah, blah, blah. How about no? How about actually there is feeling in the world. There is color in the world. There is emotion in the world. There actually is longing in the lavender and coral of a sunset, even if I'm not looking at it. That's a very interesting way of looking at the world, and that's where we start to get into Rudolf Steiner's work.
I love Steiner. But there, again, that's subjectivity.
Sorry.
All of the you're able to interact with is all subjective and relative to specifically your point of observation. So in the collective sphere, I guess if every individual subject is a piece of like a larger network where everything is connected or broken into shards, whatever, subjectivity is the only thing that really matters in a system that is going to functionally serve as a social maintenance, I guess, of the species at large, right? So collectively, big picture, we need subjectivity to be an important part of our religious belief system. Otherwise, it does break, right? Because subjectivity is such a big part of our reality. Everything you can experience is really just your experience and nobody else's. Other people might have experiences that are very similar to or on the same bandwidth as yours, but their point in space and observational perspective and awareness level is different. So you can't have two people have the exact same experience, right? Subjectivity is huge in our belief system of the physics of our universe. Why would it not be huge in the physics of the belief system of our religion, right? And once you can master that and conquer that on its own, then you got it. You own it. Right. So believe whatever you know.
Right, but those are the very presumptions we need to be looking very carefully at right now. What about empathy? Right? You know, what happens when you are actually feeling with another person? Right?
Resonant awareness. That's like a hive mind hookup. The Wi-Fi link just synced up to your, modem or whatever. That's all that is. That's what empathy is.
And maybe that's also what we're doing when we look at a sunset and feel those emotions.
We're remembering every emotion that anybody ever felt while looking at the sunset, right? Right, but it's the air, it's the ether, it's all the data floating around us all the time that we don't hone in on and interpret and translate into our brain. All you see is only 1% of all there is data all around. Right? Well, just like fish are swimming in an ocean and they don't know what an ocean is, we are swimming in an ocean of data and we can't interact with it either. We don't, but we do interact with it. We're not aware.
Like it's not a passive reception, right? It's an active relationship between you and whatever it is that interfaces you with that which you are interfaced with, for lack of words.
Right, and take it back to Walter Russell. Everything is a wave, right? Everything is light and everything is a wave. And so everything passes through you. It doesn't happen to you. You know what I mean?
Well, Keelan, I heard you.
So let's come back to that.
I heard you talking about this in your most previous upload from last night. I think the other day, and I haven't finished it.
Oh, the conversation with the dude.
Yeah, I paused it right where at a part that I was gonna bring up to somebody. I was like, "You gotta watch this." What he says here, and it's my age old. And I think we kind of had a brief little interchange about this in the chat before. You bring up the relationship between consciousness and reality, and Bernardo Kastrup and Donald Hoffman and your problem with them, right? And I'm like, wait, no, hold on a second, because you mapped out this whole thing, and I'm like, yes, that's exactly right, and I agree that I see it that way. But then then you say that they're in the mentality for it, but then they pigeonhole themselves. They limit themselves to a constrained corner of logic, right? That you're kind of seeing beyond. And I'm like, wait, hold on, where's the discrepancy? Because I feel like what they're saying, I'm like, yes. What you're saying, I'm like, yes. So how are they? Why is there a lack of resolution between them for you? Or am I just not?
Okay, let's come back to this.
I'm sorry, no, you.
Let's come back to this real quick. I need to let me grab some coffee and let my voice chill for a second. I'm getting kind of hoarse. Let's take a break, just a minute, and then we'll get back into this. So that's okay.
Pick each other's brain for a little while. Give them a moment to.
Oh, 100%. And we have plenty to play with, so this is good.
Okay, cool. Be right back.
Yeah, for sure. What a fun conversation. I'm so glad this happened.
Well, there's quite a few things too from earlier back that you guys brought up that I guess I have to work on some of my Buddhistic, my attachments and such, because I'm still hung up on these things that you guys were speaking about earlier.
What do you mean?
I think, therefore I am, and there were some deeper implications to that were suggested, that he kind of kind of sort of circumvented that and then moved on. And I wanted to pick the brain a little bit about that, but then also, to take everything he unpacked and kind of pack it back in under a bit of a smaller umbrella so that my brain can parse.
Are we moving too fast for you?
Well, I'm not moving fast enough, apparently.
No, you're fine.
He deconstructed the concept of form and formlessness and pitted them against each
Yeah.
other
Well,
to see what is and is not permitted, and then I guess I kind of fall out from there.
Okay, so with the cogito ergo sum portion, he was relating it to how Moses in the burning bush was like, who do I tell these people told me, because they're gonna think I'm fucking crazy. The thing in the bush was like, tell them that I am sent you. Ahaya asha ahaya, right? That's the Hebrew translation of what he said. Ahaya asha ahaya, which means I am that which I am, or it also could mean I am that which will be. So to me, in my head, Moses in the burning bush was like the Pymander situation for Thoth, right? So, it was him talking to his Megatron, or his Metatron, sorry, Transformers. But that was essentially Moses talking with his higher spirit version of himself, right? And he didn't know how to explain that. And he was like, I am that I am, or I am that which will be. I am that which we could all attain to become, but I am in all of us individually, right? And then you take that over to the Buddhist or the Eastern philosophical perspective, and it's like formlessness. Formlessness is the I am, whereas, the human body is the material, which is, form.
Right.
But because of Western thought, because of the Greeks, because of the opportunity we had there in the Age of Enlightenment, there was this switchover between, the masculine form and the masculine formlessness, right? So there's the form was always about being strong, and formlessness is more about being a wider bandwidth, I guess. Does that make sense?
So think of it this way.
Yes.
When we could actually start with Plotinus here. This is interesting. So in Plotinus's text, it's just called On Matter. He's trying to make sense of how corporeality at all can exist within this kind of Platonic metaphysics, Platonic cosmology. He basically ends up arriving at this kind of inevitable conclusion that, if form is pure being, then formlessness is kind of nothingness. And therefore, when we're encountering the pure forms in themselves, we're encountering pure truth, pure reality, and therefore materiality, embodiment, is this participation in this formlessness, which is just within that Platonic cosmology, at least, it's really just deteriorating. It's corrupting the pure form, as it were. And so Plotinus says that everything matter tells us is a lie. Everything it pretends to be, it is not. Essentially, this formlessness, this materiality, this darkness that underlies all matter, is the formless form of pure apparentness. Okay? And so within that appearance reality distinction, then you can see how that makes sense. But then think about it this way. Pure apparentness, that's pure experientiality, pure capacity for being beheld, for being witnessed, for being felt. Right? Something interesting going on here, isn't there? If you think about your consciousness in general, the way that you experience, the way that you feel anything, you can see that really your consciousness, it's not any of the things that populate it. Your consciousness is not your thoughts, your feelings, your memories, your visual field, or any of the things in it, sight, smells, whatever the case may be. It's this other thing that's always kind of behind those things. It's a kind of formlessness, which is informed by that which we encounter in the world. Whenever you look at something or feel anything, that thing which you are encountering beyond yourself is informing the formlessness that is your consciousness, right? The raw material that is your consciousness is being formed. It is being given a kind of determinacy by that which is outside yourself. And this is why you have this distinction where form is considered to be the primordial masculine and formlessness is considered to be the primordial feminine. And this is very important within Western thought, because within Western thought, that distinction is also the distinction between good and evil, because Western civilization, and this includes the Near East, by the way, and North Africa, that whole world has some very, very serious mommy issues, and I don't mean that metaphorically. I do mean it metaphorically, but I also mean it very literally as well. You can see it in individual psychology as well. You see it in the myth of Marduk and Tiamat very clearly. The Great Mother is the great dragon of the underlying chaos that we feel we must protect ourselves against. How do we do that? By the forms which are bestowed from the celestial Father from on high, the fishing net and the spear used by Marduk to slay Tiamat and her dragon offspring. So this is interesting then, because what we end up finding when we start to really look into the nature of subjectivity itself, which the Greeks had no conception of whatsoever, neither did the ancient Buddhists or Hindus. There was no notion of this I amness as this fundamental feeling which underlies reality. You only find that, and you find it in between the lines in exactly one tradition, and that's the ancient Hebrews. Right? And again, it's you have to read between the lines, because it's considered to be this almost extremely dangerous occult knowledge, that I amness, that reflectivity of experientiality is the core of reality itself. It was not allowed. It was forbidden to speak the true name of God within the Hebrew religion. It was only under very specific ritualistic circumstances that the true name of God, quote, as it is written, could be spoken. Well, why is that? What's the true name of God within the Hebrew religion? Where do we actually see that in the Hebrew Bible? It's not Yahweh, it's not Adonai, it's Eya, it's I am. So why wouldn't individuals be allowed to say that? Because it's a reflexive pronoun, right? So when you say Eya, when you say I am, well, now that's pointing to you. And you're putting yourself on the same level as God. And that was considered to be sacrilegious, except in very specific circumstances. And what's really interesting here is that it's that exact same tradition that we start getting this notion of theosis start to come about. We see it in the myth of Metatron, right? Enoch, he ascends and becomes Metatron and becomes on this kind of level plane with God himself. And this was considered to be an immense heresy within the Jewish religion. And then Jesus comes along, and you get an even more radical version of that, where Jesus doesn't need to ascend into the heavens to become God. He already is. Cradle to grave.
And that is because of the Immaculate Conception, which in and of itself is a twisted alchemical truth.
I don't think the immaculateness of the conception is that important, frankly. In fact, I would say that is a result of the Western mommy issues. It's because think about it. Like, it's, if Joseph impregnated Mary, well, then that kind of, that's considered to be a kind of contamination, right?
Yeah.
And so there's this need to be like, well, she was different because she was pure and a virgin, and so it doesn't count. Again, it's just like all these other things that we see within the history of Christianity, this trying all these different ways to subvert what is really just the obvious statement being made by the story, which that Jesus was literally just a guy.
But he was a Virgo.
Maybe.
Right? He was born under the sun sign of Virgo, and now we all have these cult practices to marry for no reason. Right?
What about an abstraction that you
I don't know
from it? Can you kind of see an equivalent in there that it's sort of describing something from nothing, this immaculate conception. It's kind of almost a scientific equivalent, or it's not scientific, it's like a metaphysical abstract equivalent to our scientific notion of like a Big Bang having no prior, qualities to
being self-born.
anything into, yeah. And it's essentially like like a wellspring of potential dynamism brought on by itself, which means no penetration from a masculine counterpart, right? Sophia, right? Because, the
Right.
Gnostic instinct here, being that something is born of an immaculate conception, it's kind of like the birth of Christ is a description of the birth of the cosmos, really, scaled down to a level of human relatability. And it's an idea that,
I mean, yes, and that's the key part right there. Human relatability. That's the key right there.
Right.
Because you can't get illiterate motherfuckers to be down with the same idea unless they can relate to it. Is where I'm at. But okay, immaculate conception in alchemical transmutation process, immaculate conception is an erotic tantric performance of chi movement throughout the body. It is third eye activation utilizing erotic energy, sex magic. Immaculate conception happens because of sex magic, to put it frankly. But it's a whole yogic practice of breathing and moving chi and utilizing sexual energies, because erotic zone energies are the energies that animate life. So to activate third eye really quickly, you get two batteries of opposite charge and you smush them together, and then they become one very large battery that now is a channel for energy. You move that energy to certain places and boom, Bob's your uncle. Now you have third eye activation. Like, that's what immaculate conception is. It is utilizing generative, creative energies of the erotic chi called Qing. Instead of making another fractalized version of the soul, what you do is you take that same energy that would become a person and you put it, into places that would open up your awareness with a radius of another auric field, right?
Okay, what I hear there is not mirroring
That's immaculate conception.
this, because you're saying like a reciprocation of the plus and negative charge within its own closed system, not needing anything out from outside of it. But that is speaking to a male or masculine feminine dynamic, which would not mirror what I was saying about Sophia acting without her counterpart. I don't know. I just saw like a correlation there, but I mean, that could be wrong.
No, you can correlate it to the demiurge, of course, but at the end of the day, immaculate conception alchemically is a sex magic practice, or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't have to go beyond that. It doesn't have to be, I mean, she doesn't have to be a virgin, is what I'm saying, to have a virgin birth. It can just be that there was no, person created. It was a,
Well, let's talk about sexuality a bit, because this is actually very important as well, I would say. So, yeah, you said that the erotic energies are those which animate life. That's definitely true. But why is that? Okay. So the reason is that eroticism is the achievement of unity from separation and incompleteness, right? Within certain organisms, we don't see this. Within microorganisms, sponges, things like that, we do see purely, what's the word I'm looking for here? Asexual reproduction. But within most higher organisms, we do see sexual reproduction. And what's going on here is that there is a feeling of incompleteness, right? That this tension that is felt as a kind of void within us, which we want to resolve, right? And what's really interesting here about human beings is I think I would say that we are the most sexual creatures on the planet. In fact, we're probably the most sexual creatures imaginable.
Thank you.
within the story of the Garden of Eden, we very often see these artistic depictions where the fruit of the tree of knowledge and the serpent and Eve, these are all depicted in this very sexual way. The forbidden fruit is sometimes used as a euphemism for sexuality itself. There are reasons for this, right? Because what the story of the Garden of Eden is really pointing to is the birth of a very human kind of subjectivity, where we're given knowledge of good and evil. What does that mean? It means that we're able to cognize ideas, forms, possibilities in themselves independently of that which our senses are actually encountering. I can cognize the arrowhead as an idea, as an abstraction, independently of the rock in front of me, and I can say, hey, that rock could be an arrowhead. It could be a stone axe, or whatever the case may be. It's that capacity for distinguishing between the possible and the actual, the ideal and the real, which allows for human artifice. It's how we are able to make fires and arrowheads and buildings and spaceships and Eiffel Towers and things like that. But it's also how we distinguish between the ideal and the actual, right? How things should be in contrast to how things are, right? And how much human suffering comes about because of that, because of how we want things to be in contrast to what actually is, right? It's no wonder that the ancient Hebrews would have seen that as the fall of man, but it's the beginning of the story. And what's interesting here then is that the most primary concept to be conceptualized, once the human conceptual faculties come online, once we have an inner imaginal world of things that we can experience independently of our senses, well, one of the first ideas there is the I. It is the I am, right? The self is this most basic concept. And so what happens here, you can think of it like this. If you look at organisms as made of these different layers, right? You have the physical, you have the vital, what Steiner would call the etheric, so the level of like physiological life forces, what we see in plants, bacteria, crystals, even that kind of thing. And then above that, you have sentience. And so that's the animal behavioral impulses, instincts, that kind of thing. And then the layer above that, you have ideation. You have the capacity for conceptualization, right? And nothing else on this planet has that other than human beings. You see it a little bit maybe in things like dolphins and whales, but for the most part, we have a monopoly on that. And you can think of it kind of like a zipper being unzipped on the way up, right? For plants, it's only the vital level that's unzipped, right? And so that unzipping is the separation between the masculine and the feminine, right? Because there's this selfhood there in a very embodied sense, where it's like, okay, this part of the plant is masculine, this part is feminine, and so there's a separation there that can then create a kind of potential energy towards reunification, which is eroticism, which is sexual reproduction, and so forth. With animals, then you have this split at the level of the sentient, the level of what Steiner would call the astral, right? The behavioral, the kind of consciousness of behavior and action, activity, instincts, drives, that kind of thing. And so for animals, you could say that the sexuality is a separation, not just in the vital body, but also in the sentient, in the astral, right? But for human beings, it's also at a conceptual level as well. Our sense of ourselves as an inner world of imagination, of ideas, of experience, of concepts, is something that we feel to be individuated, to be separated from the world. And so at the level of our very souls, we are sexualized. And that's exactly why we see this eroticism associated with the story of the Garden of Eden, because it is not only the birth of the human being as the artificer, as the philosopher, as the religious animal. Remember, religion means reconnection, right? But also as the most sexual being possible. Right. Our desire for romance, sexuality, whatever, it's not just physical. It's at this very existential level that we feel this need to escape the gap between ourselves and the world through uniting with other human beings. And so, with all that said, there's also a very sexual undertone within Christianity as well that has been very glossed over.
I would agree. And then it's as far as with the fruit of the tree of life representing the sexual act, as some people have jested, Eve eating from the apple and then giving it to Adam, suggesting that that is them having intercourse for the first time or whatever. If they were purely instinctual beings at that point with no like subjectivity outside of, you know, just this paradise, you know, sort of fog or whatever, they wouldn't have that connection would have been the magnetic force required to cause individual subjectivity within each of them, and then their fractalized, you know, whatever continued generations and regenerations would reflect that, you know, independent thought process, but still picking up on the resonant charge of their, you know, their vibe as either feminine or masculine in general, right? So you're still, I mean, I can see how it correlates and how it sort of like adapted over time into what it is now, if that is the mindset approaching it. But for me, good and evil was probably mistranslated, right? I'm going to be like, good and evil was probably mistranslated. It makes sense if they were to gain knowledge of, to, you know, that's a sexual connotation in and of itself, to gain knowledge of, but to gain knowledge of masculine and feminine, that does also suggest some type of sexual specific requirement there, right? So I'm going to be like, it all comes back to, you know, erotic energy and the tantra, like even in the biblical code, that's what it points at for me anyway. That's all I can see. I can see the yoga in it, I guess. The Eastern thought wave hidden under Western thought and how it can be twisted. But you see the sexualization specifically of women in the Bible consistently, and in that time period, you know, it was completely acceptable and normal, and it just gets worse and worse.
That moment, you know, soon after, where they're kind of called out on for their embarrassment of their nudity, you know. And he's like, you know, he notices, you know, you didn't feel that way before. You know, it didn't matter that you were naked, and now it matters to you. What's the deal with that, right? And that's kind of.
Ooh, there's a lot going on in that bit too. Yeah, the nakedness.
Hard, yeah, the embarrassment that used to matter a lot to me. I was like, what is that? There's so much more going on in there than your Sunday school teacher is going to talk about. What do you have to say?
Right. My thing was, sorry, I was just going to say, my thing was bestiality. I was obsessed with bestiality. Like, nobody could answer that to me. Why are these people being told over and over not to have sex with animals? It blew my mind, and nobody could answer me.
Well, that nakedness, that's that. I mean, you got to understand. There's layers and layers of psychological and spiritual symbolism going on here with that nakedness, right? Like, that nakedness is not just bodily nakedness; it's that too. But it's the nakedness that is the core of our subjectivity, because it is, in a strange way, this perfect amalgamation of pure form and pure formlessness. It is ultimate unity, right? But it's also this completely unformed clay, in a sense, and that unformedness, that malleability, is receptivity to feeling. It is the inner core of our subjectivity, the inner child that feels things the most strongly. And that's what we try to protect by creating all these different shells around that. That's the clothing that we put on to try and shield that inner core of subjectivity from a world that we don't trust. That's the shame. That's what that is. It's this feeling of this deeply rooted sense of vulnerability in relation to a world that we now feel ourselves on a spiritual level to be separated from. Whereas when we were plants and animals, or whatever the case may be, that sense of separation wasn't there. That shame, therefore, wasn't there yet.
I like it. I like it. Because, you know, plants are still directly connected to the earth. Minerals are definitely still directly connected to the earth. And you feel that love all around you all the time. You don't really have to think about it. But when you get up and start walking around, you don't have roots anymore. The love, you're not always in the presence of your creator. It's the same. I feel it. And it makes sense. And I love the way you explain that, Keelan. That was beautiful.
Yeah, the separation that we feel is as extreme as it can get, I would say, because again, it's this, you know, the whole good and evil thing, right? It's this fact that within the fact that we feel ourselves to be an inner world at all, right? The fact that we can have ideas, thoughts, imaginations, things that are within our minds that aren't in the world. So that creates this separation between an inner world and an outer world. And that creates this existential tension that is the source of a very uniquely kind of human sexuality, our sense of shame, and what is ultimately going to point us towards what the ultimate resolution of that is going to be, which is discovering what love actually is. And that's how Christianity is supposed to be the climax of that whole narrative.
Everything you just
is
manifesting itself quite apparently in the Western world as of late.
I know they felt all that Christian love. They felt all that Christian love in Salem, Massachusetts, in the 1800s. I know that.
Well, this is where we need to, you know, if we're going to talk about this and take it seriously, we can't think of Christianity as a religion. We have to think of it as an underlying force within the collective unconscious. That's how Jung saw it. That's the way to see it. The manifestations of it that parade around the banner of Christianity, that proclaim themselves to be Christianity, are hardly relevant in that story. Again, even medieval Christianity, medieval Christendom, was an uneasy compromise. The Christianity of evangelical Protestantism that we see there in Salem, same thing. I would go so far as to say that Christianity has been embryonic for the past 2,000 years. It's never been fully born yet. What it has been doing is it's been in our collective unconscious, completely restructuring the human. Our entire world has been torn asunder by it, because what it's doing is it's creating a chrysalis, and then it's breaking us down. Christianity, real Christianity, is going to be something very, very strange, and it's something that I'm not sure if we're even ready for yet, but we're getting there.
I appreciate this extremely patient perspective.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know. I wonder how Christianity is going to outlive the age of information.
In a sense, geocentrist, but really it was a polar cosmology that was dominant during the most ancient times, where the pole star was considered to be the center of the universe. And so you had this kind of world axis, right, that moved around that. And so you had this kind of Hyperborean understanding of the cosmos, and that would gradually become more and more fixated on the sun over time, over the course of thousands of years. And really the Copernican revolution was just the final nail in that coffin, in a sense.
And so our view of the physics of the universe changes based off of our level of awareness of ourselves, and takes us back to subjectivity again, because everything is relative to the subject in its mind, right?
Everything is relative to the subject in its mind. Well, I would say this, at least. I would say that as the way that we conceptualize the world changes, coffin in a sense.
And so our view of the physics of the universe changes based off of our level of awareness of ourselves, and takes us back to subjectivity again, because everything is relative to the subject in its mind, right?
Everything is relative to the subject in its mind. Well, I would say this at least. I would say that as the way that we conceptualize the world changes, the way the world is disclosed changes. There's a lot of different worlds that we could be living in. We could be living in a polar-centric universe. I mean, that's perfectly consistent. You can make that perfectly consistent with all of modern physics and science and all that stupid bullshit if you wanted to. It's not hard. You could reconcile that with all of our empirical observations. You could do that. That possibility is there latent in reality itself. So is a heliocentric cosmology. So is the possibility of one which is centered on the galactic nucleus. That's all there. All of these different worlds are there because the world is a composite. And what world we are revealing is going to be dependent on us in many ways. Remember again what we were talking about, the lavender dusk, right? And the emotions within that. I might feel those emotions and you might feel different emotions, but that doesn't mean it's all just in our heads. It means it's all there in the dusk, in the lavender, in the coral, in the sunset. All of that potentiality is alive in the world itself. And what our consciousness is doing is it's casting a very specific kind of light on the world, such that certain things are revealed and other things are hidden. And this is what Martin Heidegger would call the the concealed concealment within unconcealment, right? So unconcealment is aletheia in Greek. That is the revealing of the world by consciousness. And so there is always a lethe, right? Lethe, aletheia, a forgetting, a becoming hidden, which happens when we reveal things. And what's happening right now, there's a lot of things happening right now, but one thing that's very interesting that's happening right now is we're beginning to be able to perceive the world that way, as something multidimensional. We're able to perceive that the painting contains all of the emotions I feel and all those you feel and all kinds that have never been felt before. And it's all there in the structure of possibilities that is reality.
I would say data, ether. The field of the ether is that structure of probability that we morphogenetic field link up to, and then it has a direct connection to our evolutionary process. We just have to expand our awareness to that frequency, and then it's written into our field, and then it's projected into our offspring. Like the next generations can get it because we got it once upon a time, right? And it works the same backwards. All of our evolutionarily, imprinted instincts are still there. We don't know where it came from because we don't use it on a daily basis, but one version of our ancestors use that emotion on a daily basis, and so we still have access to it, right? And it's all in the field all around us, and it's dependent upon our awareness level, our frequency of available sensory perception. But there again, like you said before, it's just the light of the sun projecting our ideas in front of us so that we can interact with them and learn, I guess, and grow. I can't really imagine any other outcome but learning and growing. But there again, what are we growing? What are we learning? We're growing our level of awareness, and we're learning which way to direct that growth, I guess.
Everything about what
Indeed.
you were just talking about kind of concerns some other notion, a little side quest maybe, that I wanted to ask, and either or both of you could answer. All right. So what to you is, and I know terms can be so loaded, but what is the Akashic? What is the Akashic record and what does it do? But your answer to that, I have a more perhaps fundamental direction I'm taking it in a follow-up notion. What do you think? What is this Akashic space, or what people call as like a library, a metaphysical library where all information goes and things like this? What do you think about that?
Well, the Akasha, if it's this ultimate receptacle that everything goes into, then what could it be other than the Great Mother, right? The great formlessness which underlies things. It's memory, right? It is this, Whitehead would call it the consequent nature of God. It's the natural world, really, or at least one pole of it. If you think about your bodies, or just any body, right? What you're seeing, what you're feeling, what you're experiencing, all of these things are kind of things that have already happened, decisions that have already been made. You're seeing these bodies of memory, right? Everything, your clothes, right? These were constructed, plant fibers, looms, blah, blah, blah. The reality of the clothing is the continuity of that past, of that memory there, right? And so what we learn from the Akasha then is that this continuity um, isn't necessary for the past to still be alive, even after every trace has been removed. That which has happened has still happened. Things cannot unhappen. They're still there and accessible through the Akashic record.
All right, so okay, I agree with you on all that. So granted that, I've had this notion where I kind of like to sum it up and say, the Akashic is what telos is doing, or maybe what you would say telesis, right? In that, and if I think that
it's the act.
the CTMU rhymes with this, right? Chris Lincoln's CTMU, where we're all sort of telic nodes, right? For his, what the CTMU calls God, in that we're kind of doing what telesis needs of us, or what telos needs of us, and it gets written into the Akashic. But then to go back, because I'm not asking all this for nothing, to go back to what you said before about there is an animating principle that matters, even if it's ultimately subjective, right? And then that means that it's asking something particular, right? It's asking something particular to be written in. If this Akashic space, say it's to begin to, okay, quote unquote, to begin with, temporally contradictory terms here that we can't avoid, but granted it's empty to begin with, right? It's this clean thing that's awaiting to be transcribed upon, or not transcribed, to be written on, to be painted on, to be impressed upon. Once it is, if we have free will, which I know is a whole other side quest, then we could very well be writing the wrong record, right? That, or not, well, not the record that's asked of us, right? And that there's something.
Well, yeah, that's where things get very interesting, right? Because that past is full of mistakes, full of all kinds of guilt and fear and demons and addictions and so on and so forth. And ultimately, what we have to understand here is that what the ultimate telos of reality is aiming for is not just perfection in the sense of this perfectly pure, uncontaminated oneness. If that's what it was trying to do, then it just wouldn't do anything. It would just sit there because it's already that from the beginning, right? Satchidananda, being consciousness bliss. That's what you get by default, right? So why do anything, right? Why do anything? Because that's not the point. The point is not bliss. The point is intensity of beauty. And you can see this in art. You can see it in music. Music is the best metaphor for anything philosophically. It's absolutely beautiful because music, the basic structure of music is the basic structure of reality. Good music is not perfectly consonant music. Perfectly consonant music would just be one fucking sine wave over and over again forever. Nobody wants to listen to that. You want to hear notes that are out of tune. You want to hear dissonant chords that resolve into something prettier. You want this rise and fall of tension. There needs to be ugliness. There needs to be tragedy. There needs to be fear. There needs to be pain so that those things can then be sublimated, because it's through the redemption of that negativity that intensity of beauty is achieved. You've never read a story in which nothing bad happened, right? At that point, it's not a story. It's just a statement of boring facts, right? There needs to be tragedy, right, in order for this resolution to occur. And that resolution, the beauty that is made from the tragic, that's harmony. And that's what that's what reality is aiming for. That's why it's not just sitting there in a state of pure, undifferentiated, infinite bliss, because that's empty. That's boring. It wants more than that. It has a lust for life.
Necessary for there to even be a story. What's more tragic than a tritone? You know, you would wonder why the church bans the use of tritone in any of the musical literature that they composed in their time. What could be more tragic than hearing something like that just kind of slap you in the face out of nowhere in the middle of something like Mozart or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then as you start working with those dissonances instead of trying to avoid them, well, then you get the whole Western harmonic tradition, which, you know, I know there's lots of musicology people who have brains full of fucking dog shit who will tell you that, oh, well, it's just culturally relative, man. No, 12 tones is very special because it's divisible by 3 and 4. And that's very significant in terms of sacred geometry and all this other shit. But anyway, the Western tonal tradition is just inconceivably beautiful. I mean, it's yes, there's other kinds of music that are very interesting in their own right, things like microtonality and gamelan music and all that other jazz. Yes, it's cool, but the ability to use dissonance to create harmonies that can weave together all kinds of different perspectives, all kinds of different keys and modes, and to bring them together into something that feels cohesive. I mean, that's the fucking underlying spirit that we need to align ourselves with, because that's how we reconcile the need for community, the need for love, with this trajectory towards increasing individualization that we're upon. There has to be...
Real quick, sorry. At the beginning, you just kind of go, you know, how did you put it? Beauty intensified, yeah? So would it then just be, you know, to just keep intensifying, and that the ability to continue intensifying that beauty is endless. So just keep going. Would you say that's it?
I guess so. I mean, if there's an end to this, then that's beyond me. I very much believe that when we look up at the stars, we're looking at previous iterations of what's happening right now on Earth. We're looking at the groundwork being laid for the possibility that we're currently acting out. I believe that our solar system is an embryonic star, and our solar system ultimately, and Steiner would say this as well, is ultimately going to become what he calls future Vulcan, and I think it's a good name for it for various reasons, but is going to be a state in which all of the human souls, all of the human subjectivity, and all of our past, all of our bodies are synthesized into one great harmonic symphony. After that, then what? I don't know, but I think this is not just a bottleneck for humanity. I don't think it's just a bottleneck for Earth. I think it's a bottleneck for our entire cosmos. I don't think anything like this has ever happened before. I think it's something that had to be singular. It had to be us, and that's what we're here for. And what comes after that is really hard to say, but It'll be something. Maybe it does just go on forever.
Yeah, I mean, I have no follow up. I think that kind of exhausts the what I have to to pick from your brain about it.
Well, yeah, I'm kind of running out of steam myself.
Video, yeah.
So-
I mean, it kind of just goes to show. I mean, I always say this, but it just goes to show how rich the content is if you can barely get through a few minutes of it without having like a 2-hour conversation with somebody about it. So that's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I feel like if we do this again sometime, we should dig into this subjectivity thing a bit more, and especially the stuff with regards to, yeah, like the relationship between subjectivity and objectivity, and what's in our heads, quote unquote, versus what's in the world. That could be a very, very interesting conversation to bear down on, or we could talk about something completely different. It's whatever, but
No,
totally do this again sometime.
I agree, and I've had such a great conversation thus far as well. And I want to thank you again for coming on and hanging out with us, and giving us so much to think about and so much to think through.
Yeah, very stimulating.
All right, well, great. Glad to hear it, guys. Yeah, this is very fun. Absolutely.
We'll talk to you later. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks for having me on. Take it easy, guys. Later.